I found out my fiancé invited her ex to our wedding because his name was sitting on our seating chart between my Aunt Carol and my cousin Nate. Not in a maybe I'm reading that wrong way. Not in a there must be another Evan way. I was standing in our kitchen 6 weeks before the wedding, looking over the table cards Claire had spread across the island, and there it was in black ink, Evan Marshall, table 6. I stared at it for a second, waiting for my brain to make it make sense. It didn't. Now, I knew exactly who Evan was. Claire had made sure of that. He was the ex she described as the worst decision of my 20s. The guy she said drained 3 years out of her life, lied to her, cheated at least once depending on which version of the story you heard, and somehow always made everything about himself. She used to talk about him like he was a cautionary tale she barely escaped. So seeing his name on our wedding seating chart felt like finding a lit match in a gas leak. I looked up and said, "Why is Evan on our seating chart?" Claire didn't flinch, didn't freeze, didn't look caught. She just moved another name card and said, "Because I invited him." That was it, flat, casual, like I'd asked why she ordered extra candles. I actually laughed because for 1 second I thought she had to be joking. She looked at me, already irritated. "What? You invited your ex to our wedding?" She sighed. Long and tired, like I was making her explain gravity to a child. Yes, I did. I set my water glass down because I could feel the anger coming up fast, and I didn't want to go there yet. We were 6 weeks out, deposits were gone, flights were booked. Her parents had rented a beach house for relatives. My mother had somehow turned small wedding into welcome baskets and custom tags. Everything was in motion. So I sat down across from her and tried to sound like a sane man talking to the woman he was about to marry. "Can you explain to me why your ex is coming to our wedding?" Claire folded her arms and gave me a look I'd seen before. It was the look she used right before turning something she'd done into a flaw in my personality. "He's not just my ex," she said. "He was a huge part of my life for years." That wasn't an answer. It was a setup. I asked if they'd been talking. "A little." "What does a little mean?" She shrugged. "Here and there." "How long?" That's when her face changed. Not guilt, annoyance. "Why are you interrogating me?" That word hit me immediately. Interrogating, not asking, not trying to understand. Interrogating. That was Claire's thing. If she did something objectively weird, the conversation somehow became about my tone, my trust, my insecurity, my reaction. She had this polished way of taking a normal response and making it sound ugly. I said, "I'm not interrogating you. I'm asking why the guy you've spent 2 years calling manipulative and selfish is suddenly getting a seat at our wedding." She rolled her eyes, because unlike some people, I'm capable of moving on without turning my past into a crime scene. That was Claire too. She never defended the behavior directly if she could elevate it into something flattering to herself. It wasn't "I invited my ex to our wedding." It was "I'm emotionally evolved enough not to erase people." It wasn't "I hid this from you because I knew you'd hate it." It was "I don't believe in fear-based relationships, and if you pushed back, suddenly you weren't reacting to what she did. You were revealing something broken about yourself. I told her this had nothing to do with erasing people. It had to do with the fact that she invited a man she used to describe like a warning label and somehow never mentioned it to me. That got me the first honest answer of the night. "I didn't mention it because I knew you'd react like this." There it was. Not "I forgot," not "I didn't know how to bring it up," not "I was waiting for the right moment." She knew I'd have a problem with it. She knew enough to hide it. She did it anyway. That should have been the end of the conversation. Maybe the relationship. It wasn't. Because the second I got quiet, Claire softened her voice and hit me with the line that worked on me far longer than I care to admit. "If you trusted me, this wouldn't be such a big deal." I hate that sentence now. I hate how clean it sounds, how adult it sounds, because it takes a boundary issue and turns it into a character test. Now the problem isn't her ex at the wedding. Now the problem is whether I'm secure enough to handle it. I told her trust wasn't the same thing as having no boundaries. She said inviting one person from her past wasn't a boundary issue. It was me projecting insecurity onto her. So I asked if she'd be okay with me inviting my ex Natalie. Claire didn't even blink. Yes. That was such obvious bullshit, I almost laughed again. Natalie wasn't some harmless old chapter to Claire. A year earlier, I'd mentioned running into Natalie's brother at a grocery store, and Claire had gone cold for the rest of the evening. She had never been remotely relaxed about my past. She was only suddenly enlightened because this time it benefited her. I pointed that out. She told me I was missing the point. I asked what the point was, and then she said something that, at the time, almost worked on me. I don't want to start my marriage feeling like I'm still running from old parts of my life. I can admit that line landed, not because it made sense, it didn't. If you need your ex physically present at your wedding to prove you're over him, you're probably not over him. But the way she said it made it sound thoughtful instead of insane, like I was hearing some deep emotional truth I wasn't evolved enough to understand. So I asked, "And having him there helps you prove that?" She paused, then said, "I want to know I can stand in a room with every chapter of my life and still choose you." That's the kind of sentence Claire was good at. The kind that sounds profound until you hold it up to the actual situation. Because stripped down, what she was saying was this: I need my ex at our wedding so I can feel something about choosing you. That should have disgusted me. Instead, I found myself trying to decode whether I was hearing vulnerability or manipulation. With Claire, those two things wore the same face. By midnight, we had what I convinced myself was a compromise. Evan could come, but he wouldn't be near us. He wouldn't be invited to the rehearsal dinner, and if she had any wedding-related communication with him, she'd be transparent about it. Even writing that makes me tired. Because look at the shape of that compromise. My fiancé invites her ex behind my back, and somehow the resolution becomes me negotiating the terms under which her ex gets to attend our wedding. But I wanted peace. I wanted this to be one weird hill she'd chosen to die on, not evidence of something rotten underneath. So I took the deal. For the next week, Claire was almost suspiciously sweet. She cooked twice. She kept touching my shoulder when she walked past. She sent me one of those stupid engagement reels with the caption, "Still marrying you, by the way." At the time, it felt like reassurance. Later, I realized it felt more like stabilization, like she'd pushed too far and needed to smooth the surface before I started asking better questions. The first real crack came the following Saturday morning. Claire was in the shower. Her phone was on the kitchen counter next to me while I made coffee, and the screen lit up with a text preview from someone saved as E. I wasn't snooping. I just looked down because it lit up right next to my hand. The message said, "When will laugh when you see what your mom picked for the centerpieces." That was it. Nothing sexual, nothing explosive, but enough to make me stand there with the coffee machine hissing in the background and my stomach tightening. Because why the hell was Evan texting Claire about our centerpieces? I didn't bring it up right away, mostly because I was embarrassed by how fast my mind went there. I didn't want to become the guy who policed every message from every man with an initial in her phone. So later that day, I asked casually, "Have you talked to Evan much this week?" Claire was folding laundry on the couch. She didn't look up. "Not really." Why? That "not really" bothered me more than it should have. Not because I could prove it was a lie, because it was the kind of answer people use when they want wiggle room. I said no reason, just asking. She finally looked up, held my eyes for half a second too long, then went back to folding towels. That should have been forgettable. It wasn't. 2 nights later, we were at her parents' house for dinner, and her younger sister Megan said, "So did you and Evan ever figure out the playlist thing?" Everything in the room changed. Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her mother dropped her eyes to her plate so fast it was almost funny. Megan realized immediately she'd stepped on something and did that awkward half-laugh people do when they know they just walked into a fight they weren't supposed to know existed. And I sat there staring at Claire because I knew, with complete certainty, that there had never been any conversation where she mentioned the playlist thing with Evan. Claire recovered fast. "He used to work in live events," she said lightly. I asked him one question about the DJ setup because ours was being flaky. Plausible enough for dinner, not plausible enough for the drive home. The second we got in the car, I asked why her sister knew about conversations with Evan that I didn't. Claire groaned and pressed her head back against the seat. "Can we not do this right now?" "No," I said. "Actually, I think we can. Why is your ex involved in our wedding playlist?" "He's not involved in the playlist." "Then why did Megan say it like this has been an ongoing conversation?" Claire stared out the window for a second, then said, "Because I asked him one question and Megan overheard me complaining that he was being annoying about it. That's literally all it is." I asked what the question was. She said she wanted a backup contact in case the DJ bailed. I asked why she was asking Evan instead of me, or our planner, or literally anyone who wasn't the ex she invited behind my back. That's when she snapped. Because sometimes it's easier to ask someone who actually knows what they're talking about instead of making everything a symbolic relationship issue. There it was again, the move she always made. Take a normal objection and make it sound primitive, emotional, beneath her. I said, "You understand how weird this looks, right?" She turned to me and said, "No, I understand how weird you're making it." We drove home in silence. When we got back, she went upstairs. I stayed in the living room pretending to watch baseball while replaying dinner in my head, especially the way her mother had looked down at her plate the second Megan said Evan's name. That part bothered me almost more than Megan's comment, because sisters can be careless. Mothers usually know exactly when not to speak. The next morning, I got my first real glimpse of how much Claire had lied about how often she and Evan were talking. We were on the couch, going through hotel blocks for out-of-town guests, when Claire got up to grab a charger from the bedroom. She left her phone face up on the coffee table, unlocked. Again, I wasn't snooping. I didn't pick it up, I didn't scroll. But the text thread open on the screen had Evan's name at the top, and in the 2 seconds before I looked away, I saw enough to make my chest go cold. There were dozens of messages, not 1 or 2 recent texts, not some old thread she'd forgotten to delete. A wall of current conversation. Ongoing. Frequent. She came back into the room before I could see anything specific, but it didn't matter. I'd already seen enough to know a little, and not really, were complete bullshit. So I asked her, as evenly as I could, "How often are you actually talking to Evan?" She looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me. And instead of answering, she said, "Did you read my messages?" That was when something in me shifted. Not because she asked, because of how fast she reached for the counterattack. I told her no. The thread was open. I saw it by accident. I was asking because she'd told me they barely spoke. She picked up the phone and locked it. "So now you're monitoring how many texts I send?" "Stop doing that," I said. "Doing what?" Turning a simple question into some accusation about my character. Claire folded her arms and looked at me for a long second. Then, very quietly, she said, "You're acting like I'm cheating on you." That word changed the room, not because I believed she was sleeping with him. At least, not then. But because I hadn't said cheating. Not once. Everything I'd asked up to that point was about honesty, boundaries, and why her ex seemed to be woven into our wedding planning like an unpaid consultant. But the second she said cheating, the whole conversation moved. Now I wasn't asking why she lied. Now I was defending myself against the implication that I thought she was some sneaky fiancé having an affair behind my back. I told her I never said she was cheating. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I can hear what you're implying." And there it was again, the sleight of hand. The way she could drag the whole conversation 3 feet to the left until I was suddenly explaining myself instead of getting answers. The worst part is that it worked. Not completely, but enough, because I did what I always did with Claire when she accused me of seeing her unfairly. I softened. I clarified. I tried to be precise. I told her I didn't think she was physically cheating. I thought she was being dishonest about how much space this guy still took up in her life, and I didn't understand why. That should have been the moment she answered. Instead, she got teary. Not dramatic crying, just a couple of quiet tears and a shaky voice. She said she was exhausted. That wedding planning was already making her feel pulled in 100 directions, and now the person who was supposed to be her safe place was making her feel watched and judged over every interaction. She said she'd spent years trying not to let men control who she could talk to. She said she thought I was different, and because I was still trying to save the version of us that made sense, I ended up apologizing for how the conversation had spiraled. Not for my concern exactly, but for making her feel attacked. Even now, writing that makes me sick, because that was the pattern with Claire. I'd walk into a conversation with a legitimate problem and somehow leave it feeling guilty for not raising it in a way that made her comfortable. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to force myself into the most generous version of events. Maybe she really had reconnected with him in some harmless way and just didn't realize how bad it looked. Maybe I was letting wedding stress make me obsessive, Maybe once you know someone's name is in the story, every weird little detail starts fitting into a pattern, whether it belongs there or not. I wanted to believe that. I really did. Then the next morning, while Claire was still asleep, her laptop lit up on the dining table with an email preview from our florist. The subject line was boring. Something about revised stem counts. What mattered was the list of recipients underneath: the florist, Claire, and Evan Marshall. I stared at the email preview long enough for the screen to dim. Then I touched the trackpad and read it again. The florist, Claire, Evan Marshall. There are moments when your brain tries very hard to protect you by offering smaller explanations first. Maybe he was copied by mistake. Maybe Claire forwarded him one vendor email because of the DJ thing. Maybe there was some stupid, harmless reason I couldn't see yet. The problem was, I'd already burned through most of my harmless explanations. When Claire came downstairs 20 minutes later, I was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open in front of me. I didn't yell. I didn't do the dramatic, "Who the hell is this" thing. I was way past that. My voice was so calm, it actually scared me a little. Why is Evan on emails with our florist? Claire stopped halfway into the kitchen, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw something real flicker across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like she was rapidly recalculating which version of the truth would cost her the least. "It's not what it looks like," she said. I actually laughed at that, because there's probably no sentence in the English language less useful than that one. "Then tell me what it looks like." She set her mug down, came over, and glanced at the laptop like she was annoyed I'd forced her to deal with something tedious before coffee. "He has a friend who does floral installs for events." I asked him a couple questions about whether the florist's quote was normal. "A couple questions?" "Yes." "Then why is he copied on the email chain?" Claire crossed her arms. "Because he offered to look at it for me. It's not a crime." "No," I said. "It's just insane." That got her attention. "What's insane," I said, "is that your ex somehow went from 'I barely talked to him' to being copied on vendor emails for our wedding. And every single time I find out something new, it's by accident." She opened her mouth, but I kept going. "The playlist, the centerpieces, the florist, the wall of texts you lied about. What else am I supposed to call this?" Claire's expression hardened. "You're being dramatic." "No, Claire, I'm finally being specific." That landed harder than I expected, because she actually went quiet for a second. So I pushed. "I want to see the messages." She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "No." "Then we're done." I didn't say it loudly. I didn't stand up. I just said it like a fact, because at that point, it was one. I wasn't going to marry a woman who kept feeding me 1/3 of the truth and calling me insecure every time I noticed the missing pieces. Claire stared at me for a few seconds, probably trying to figure out whether I meant it. Apparently I looked like I did, because she exhaled, unlocked her phone, and handed it over. "Fine. Read them. I'm done being treated like some sneaky little liar because you can't handle that I have a past." That last part almost made me hand the phone back. Not because I believed her anymore, because Claire had a way of making every concession feel like an act of martyrdom, like she was the wounded adult tolerating my irrationality. But I took the phone, and here's the part I'm embarrassed to admit. I was hoping I'd find something clean, something simple, something I could point to and say, "There, that's why this feels wrong." Instead, what I found was worse, because most of it, in isolation, looked harmless. There were no explicit sexts, no hotel confirmations, no "I miss you" paragraphs. Nothing you could screenshot and slam down on a table. What there was, though, was volume, familiarity, a level of access that made my skin crawl the longer I scrolled. Evan knew the date we'd first toured the venue. He knew Claire hated the bridesmaid dress color her cousin picked. He knew my mother was doing too much with the welcome bags. He knew we were arguing about whether to spend extra on the live sax player during cocktail hour. He knew our seating chart was a mess because my uncle couldn't be near my dad's second wife. He knew things no ex should know about a wedding he was supposedly just attending. And he wasn't just receiving updates. He was in it. He had opinions about the music, opinions about the flowers, opinions about where the bar should go because the traffic flow in that room is weird. At one point, he'd written, "If you put your mom's friends at table 3, they're going to complain the whole night." Claire had replied, "Exactly what I said. Thank you." That one got me more than it should have, not because it was the worst thing in the thread, because it was intimate in the most humiliating possible way. They were planning around my wedding like divorced parents co-managing a school fundraiser. I kept scrolling. The messages went back months, not years, months. Far before the "we randomly ran into each other and got closure" story she'd fed me. I stopped at a text from late January, 3 months before I proposed. Evan, you really going through with the lake weekend with him? Claire, I told you, yes. Stop being weird. Evan, I'm not being weird. I'm asking if you're sure. Claire, I'm sure enough. Sure enough. Not yes. Not obviously. Not I love him. Leave it alone. Sure enough. I kept scrolling with this cold pressure building in my chest. There were gaps in the conversation where messages had obviously been deleted. You don't need to be a detective to spot it. Whole stretches where the tone jumped from tense to casual, with nothing in between. A couple of times Claire referenced things that weren't in the thread anymore. Like one message from her that said, "I told you not to send that when I'm with him." Another that said, "Delete that, seriously." There it was, not proof of an affair, but proof that she'd already decided some of her conversations with Evan needed to be hidden from me. When I looked up, Claire was standing at the counter, with her arms wrapped around herself, watching me like I was a man flipping through autopsy photos. "Well," she said. I put the phone down. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie. You told me you'd spoken to him a little. You've been talking to him for months." Her jaw tightened. We reconnected gradually. I didn't think I needed to narrate every step. I actually laughed. Narrate every step. Claire, this man knows more about our wedding than half my family. That's ridiculous. Is it? Because from what I just read, he knows about the flowers, the music, the seating chart, the venue, my mother, your cousin's dress, and our arguments about the bar layout. Should I keep going? She went silent. So I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since I saw that January text. When did this start? Claire rubbed her forehead. I don't know. Try harder. We ran into each other in the fall. That was the first time she'd given me an actual time frame. In the fall? I said. You told me it was a few months ago. It was a few months ago. It is June, Claire. In the fall is not a few months ago. She looked at me like I was being deliberately stupid. I meant a few months before we started talking regularly. There it was again, a new version, slightly different, more slippery. I asked where they'd run into each other. She said at a coffee shop downtown. I asked if that was before or after she went to Nashville with Megan last October. Claire's eyes narrowed. What does Nashville have to do with anything? Because I just remembered something I hadn't thought about in months. When Claire came back from that trip, she told me she ran into someone from her old life and spent half an hour feeling weird afterward. At the time, I hadn't pushed because she looked genuinely unsettled, and I figured she'd tell me when she wanted to. She never did. Now I knew why. You saw him in Nashville, didn't you? No, that's a lie. She let out a sharp breath through her nose. I did not go to Nashville to see Evan. That wasn't what I asked. I just stared at her. Claire caught it a second too late. Her whole face changed. That's the thing about liars who think they're smarter than everyone in the room. They don't always realize when they answer the wrong question until after it's already out. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped the floor. You saw him there. It wasn't planned. Oh, that's good. That makes it better. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Claire? She pressed both hands against the counter. Megan wanted to go out one night. We ended up at this bar, and he was there with friends. That's it. And you just forgot to mention that the mysterious person from your old life was the ex who's now helping plan our wedding. Her eyes flashed. I didn't forget. I left it alone because I knew this would happen. I laughed again, but there was nothing funny in it anymore. No, you left it alone because you wanted to keep talking to him without dealing with what that meant. That started the ugliest fight we'd ever had. Not loud. Claire still didn't scream. That was the infuriating part. She stayed cold and controlled while I finally said the things I should have said weeks earlier. I told her this wasn't about jealousy. It was about the fact that every answer she gave me got worse the moment I pulled on it. She said I was acting like context was the same thing as betrayal. I said hidden context becomes betrayal when you build an engagement on top of it. She said I was catastrophizing a reconnection that had never crossed a line. I asked what line she thought mattered at this point. She didn't answer. So I asked a simpler question. Have you been alone with him since we got together? That was the first time I saw Claire genuinely hesitate. Not for long, just a second. But it was enough. Yes, she said finally, once. Once? Maybe twice. I just stared at her. Claire looked away. It was coffee. Before or after we got engaged? Before. What I do know is that I wasn't insecure. I was being trained to ignore humiliation and call it maturity. And if I'd married her, that would have been the rest of my life.